The radio crackled with static, then silence. In that moment, 12 brave souls vanished into the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan, their fate unknown to the world below. What followed was not just a rescue mission. It was a testament to the unbreakable bond between warriors who refused to leave anyone behind. When Captain Sarah Mitchell received the distress call at 0347 hours, she had no idea she was about to write one of the most extraordinary chapters in military aviation history. The mission seemed impossible. Navigate through enemy territory, locate survivors scattered across hostile terrain, and bring them home alive. But sometimes the impossible becomes inevitable when courage meets desperation. This is the true story of Slate 12, a routine reconnaissance mission that became a nightmare, and the A-10 Thunderbolt pilot who turned the tide when all hope seemed lost. It's about the question that echoed through radio frequencies and haunted dreams. Did you forget me? And the answer that came roaring through the sky with the thunder of salvation. In the mountains where shadows hide death, and every second counts, some stories write themselves in blood, sweat, and the deafening roar of engines that refuse to quit. This is one of those stories. The morning sun cast long shadows across Bagram Airfield as Staff Sergeant Marcus Chun adjusted his headset for the third time. Something felt different about this mission, though he couldn't put his finger on what. The pre-dawn briefing had been routine. Reconnaissance sweep of the Kunar province, intelligence gathering on suspected insurgent movements, standard operating procedure for Slate 12. 12 soldiers, each handpicked for their expertise, loaded into the twin Blackhawks that would carry them into the heart of Afghanistan's most dangerous territory. Chun had served 3 tours in this godforsaken landscape, and his instincts had kept him alive when lesser men had fallen. Today, those same instincts whispered warnings he chose to ignore. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, mission commander and a veteran of countless operations, reviewed the flight path one final time. The mountains ahead held secrets that could save American lives or cost them dearly. Intelligence reports suggested a major Taliban supply route ran through the valley they were about to survey. If true, disrupting it could cripple enemy operations for months. The team consisted of reconnaissance specialists, communications experts, a medic, and enough firepower to handle whatever waited in the shadows. Sergeant First Class Maria Rodriguez, the team's communications specialist, had volunteered for this mission specifically. Her brother had died in these same mountains 2 years earlier, and every mission felt personal now. As the rotors began their familiar whir, Chun caught Harrison's eye. The lieutenant colonel nodded, a simple gesture that carried weight among soldiers who understood that every mission could be their last. The Black Hawks lifted off into the pale morning light, their shadows racing across the desert floor like dark omens. The flight to the target area took 47 minutes. Below them, the landscape transformed from barren desert to jagged peaks that scraped the sky. Ancient trade routes carved by centuries of warfare snaked through valleys where empires had risen and fallen. This was where Alexander the Great had struggled, where the British Empire had bled, where the Soviet Union had learned the cost of underestimating the Afghan mountains. Rodriguez monitored radio chatter from their base, keeping the team connected to the outside world through a delicate web of communications. Every transmission was logged, every frequency monitored. In country like this, radio silence often meant death, and maintaining contact could mean the difference between rescue and becoming another statistic. The insertion point lay in a valley, surrounded by peaks that rose like cathedral spires into the thin air. Altitude here posed its own challenges. Men moved slower, thought slower, bled faster. The team had trained for high-altitude operations, but training and reality maintained a relationship built on mutual suspicion. Chin studied the terrain through the helicopter's window, noting escape routes and defensive positions. Years of combat had taught him to think like prey and predator simultaneously. Every ridge could hide a sniper, every valley could become a killing field. But somewhere in this maze of stone and shadow lay intelligence that could turn the tide of battles yet to come. The first Black Hawk touched down in a cloud of dust and debris. Harrison's team fast-roped to the ground with practiced efficiency, establishing a perimeter while the second helicopter delivered the remaining members of Slate 12. Within 90 seconds, both aircraft were climbing back towards safer altitudes, leaving 12 Americans alone in hostile territory. Rodriguez immediately began establishing communications with their forward operating base. The radio crackled to life, confirming their successful insertion and beginning the countdown to extraction. They had 4 hours to gather intelligence and return to the landing zone. 4 hours to complete a mission that would haunt the dreams of everyone involved. The team moved through the valley like ghosts, using terrain features to mask their approach. Each man and woman carried equipment worth more than most people's annual salary. Night vision devices, satellite communication gear, weapon systems that could reach out and touch targets a mile away. But in these mountains, technology was only as good as the warrior wielding it. Chun took point, his rifle sweeping arc patterns as the team advanced. Behind him, specialist teams began their work, photographing potential supply caches, documenting vehicle tracks, measuring distances for potential artillery strikes. Every detail mattered when preparing for future operations. The valley floor showed signs of recent activity. Tire tracks in the dust, disturbed vegetation, the faint smell of diesel fuel carried on mountain winds. The intelligence reports were proving accurate. This was indeed a major supply route for insurgent forces. The question remained, where were the insurgents now? Harrison called for a brief halt while his scouts moved forward to investigate a cluster of buildings that appeared suddenly around a bend in the valley. Through binoculars, the structures looked abandoned, but appearances in Afghanistan could be more deadly than any weapon. Buildings that seemed empty often concealed fighters waiting for the perfect moment to spring their trap. Rodriguez updated their position to base command, noting landmarks and potential hazards. Her voice remained steady and professional, but those who knew her could hear the tension underneath. Every soldier in Slate 12 understood they were walking through a potential ambush zone, but the mission required them to push forward regardless of personal fears. The buildings proved empty, but not recently so. Warm ashes in a fire pit suggested occupants had fled within the last few hours. Equipment scattered throughout the structures confirmed this had been a major staging area for insurgent operations. Chin found ammunition caches, vehicle maintenance equipment, and maps marking coalition patrol routes. Harrison made the decision to continue deeper into the valley. The intelligence they were gathering exceeded expectations, but something felt wrong about the timing. Why would insurgents abandon such a valuable position unless they knew American forces were coming? The answer to that question would soon become terrifyingly clear. As Slate 12 moved further from their extraction point, none of them noticed the figures watching from concealed positions high on the surrounding ridges. Patient eyes tracked their movement through rifle scopes, waiting for radio signals that would coordinate a trap months in the making. The hunters had become the hunted, but they wouldn't realize it until escape became impossible. The valley stretched ahead like an open grave, beautiful and deadly in the harsh mountain light. Slate 12 pressed forward, gathering intelligence that would cost them everything, moving steadily toward a confrontation that would test every skill they possessed and every bond they shared. Behind them, the extraction point grew more distant with each step. Ahead lay shadows that would soon erupt in violence that would change 12 lives forever. The first shot came from nowhere and everywhere at once, the crack of a rifle echoing off canyon walls until it became impossible to determine its origin. Specialist Tommy Valdez dropped behind a boulder, his training overriding the shock that tried to freeze his muscles. Around him, Slate 12 scattered into defensive positions as the valley erupted in chaos. Chin's voice cut through the noise, calm and authoritative despite the bullets snapping overhead. Contact north, contact east, multiple shooters on the ridgeline. His rifle barked in response, sending rounds toward muzzle flashes that appeared and disappeared among the rocks like deadly fireflies. Harrison pressed himself against the valley wall, speaking rapidly into his radio. "Base, this is Slate 12. We are under heavy fire coordinates." A bullet struck the rock inches from his head, showering him with stone fragments. The radio in his hand sparked and died, its electronics shredded by shrapnel. Rodriguez crawled toward Harrison's position, her own communication equipment bouncing against her back. She had trained for moments like this, practiced countless scenarios where primary communications failed and backup systems became lifelines. But reality hit harder than any training exercise, and her hands trembled as she tried to establish contact with her base. The ambush had been planned with military precision. Insurgent fighters occupied positions that commanded every approach to the valley floor, creating overlapping fields of fire that turned the entire area into a killing zone. Escape routes that had seemed obvious during their insertion now lay exposed to enemy observation, making movement tantamount to suicide. Sergeant Rodriguez finally reached Harrison's position as bullets continued to snap overhead. Her communication attempts met only static. The insurgents had somehow managed to jam their frequencies, cutting Slate 12 off from the outside world. For the first time in her military career, she felt truly alone. "Sir, I can't raise base," she reported, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "They're jamming us across all frequencies. We're on our own until we can move to higher ground or find a way to punch through their interference." Harrison nodded grimly, his mind racing through options that seemed to shrink with each passing minute. Their extraction was scheduled in 3 hours, but the helicopters would never risk landing in a hot zone without radio contact. Slate 12 had to either break out of the ambush or find a way to signal for help. Chen had managed to identify several enemy positions, but return fire had been ineffective. The insurgents held the high ground and had prepared their positions well. Attempting to assault uphill against dug-in defenders would be suicide, but remaining in the valley meant slow death by sniper fire. Valdez spotted movement to the south, the only direction that hadn't yet erupted in gunfire. "Sergeant Chun, I've got dismounted personnel moving in from our 6. Looks like they're trying to close the back door." His rifle spoke 3 times in rapid succession, and the movement stopped. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Slate 12 found themselves surrounded by an unknown number of fighters who had chosen their ground carefully and prepared their ambush well. The Americans had superior training and equipment, but numbers and positioning favored the enemy. Dr. Sarah Kim, the team medic, low-crawled between positions to check on each team member. Combat medicine had evolved significantly since previous wars, but bullets still killed just as efficiently as they had for generations. Her job was to keep people alive long enough for evacuation, but evacuation seemed increasingly unlikely. Harrison made the decision that would define the next several hours. Rather than remain pinned in the killing zone, Slate 12 would attempt to break contact and move to a more defensible position. It meant exposing themselves to enemy fire, but staying put guaranteed eventual defeat. "Listen up," he called to his scattered team. "We're going to leapfrog north by teams. Chun, take your people and bound to that ridgeline. Rodriguez, you're with me covering their movement. When they're set, we'll follow. Anybody who can't keep up gets carried. Nobody gets left behind." The movement began with covering fire that echoed through the valley like thunder. Chen's team sprinted from cover to cover while the rest of Slate 12 poured suppressive fire at known and suspected enemy positions. Return fire was immediate and accurate, forcing the Americans to use every bit of available cover. Specialist Jake Morrison stumbled during the movement, a bullet grazing his leg and sending him sprawling in the rocky terrain. Valdez immediately changed direction, grabbing Morrison under the arms and dragging him toward shelter. The action exposed both men to concentrated enemy fire, bullets striking the ground around them like lethal hail. Rodriguez watched the movement through her rifle scope, searching for targets among the rocks above. She spotted a muzzle flash and squeezed the trigger, satisfied to see the flash disappear. Combat shooting was different from any range practice. Stress, adrenaline, and fear changed everything about marksmanship fundamentals. Dr. Kim reached Morrison's position as soon as covering fire allowed, quickly assessing his wound. The bullet had torn through muscle but missed the bone, painful but not immediately life-threatening. She applied a pressure bandage and gave him enough painkiller to keep moving. "You'll live," she told Morrison with a grim smile. "But you're going to have a hell of a scar to show off when we get back." Her confidence was practiced and professional, designed to keep wounded soldiers focused on survival rather than injury. Harrison's team began their movement as Chen's people established overwatch positions. The leapfrog maneuver was working, but slowly. Each bound brought them closer to the ridgeline, but also deeper into the valley where escape routes grew more limited with every step. The insurgents adapted their tactics as the Americans moved, repositioning fighters to maintain contact while preventing escape. It became clear that this was more than a chance encounter. The The ambush had been planned specifically for this location, suggesting intelligence leaks that made Harrison's stomach turn cold. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Slate 12 found themselves in a slightly better position, but still surrounded. The ridgeline provided some cover, but escape remained impossible while enemy fighters controlled the high ground. Their extraction window was closing, and with communications still jammed, rescue seemed increasingly unlikely. Chen observed enemy positions through his scope, counting muzzle flashes and trying to determine their numbers. The insurgents had shown remarkable fire discipline, suggesting professional training rather than the usual ragtag militia they typically encountered. This was a coordinated military operation, not a chance ambush. Rodriguez continued attempting to restore communications, trying different frequencies and power settings. Somewhere in the static, she thought she heard fragments of radio traffic, tantalizing hints that the outside world still existed. But confirming contact remained impossible while jamming continued. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Slate 12 prepared for what might be a very long night. They had food, water, and ammunition for several days, but time favored the enemy. Insurgent reinforcements could arrive, while American rescue forces remained unaware of their predicament. The radio crackled once, a brief moment of clarity in the static that made everyone freeze. Rodriguez pressed her headset closer, straining to hear anything useful. For just a moment, she thought she heard a familiar call sign, but then the jamming resumed and silence returned. That brief transmission would prove to be their lifeline, a fragment of hope in what seemed like a hopeless situation. Somewhere above the mountains, help was already on the way. Though Slate 12 had no way of knowing their guardian angel was about to arrive in the form of an A-10 Thunderbolt piloted by someone who had never forgotten the meaning of the warrior's creed. Captain Sarah Mitchell had been airborne for 6 hours when the scrambled transmission reached her A-10 Thunderbolt. The garbled radio traffic made little sense at first, fragments of call signs, coordinate references that seemed wrong, and, underneath it all, the unmistakable sound of gunfire. Her weapons systems officer confirmed what her gut already knew. Someone was in serious trouble. The A-10, nicknamed Warthog by those who flew her, was built for one purpose: close air support for troops in contact with enemy forces. Mitchell had flown dozens of missions in this same aircraft, bringing salvation to ground forces when situations turned desperate. Today would test every skill she had developed over 8 years of combat flying. Base Command vectored her toward the last known position of Slate 12, though communications remained sporadic at best. The jamming that had isolated the ground team was also affecting aircraft frequencies, creating gaps in information that could prove deadly. Mitchell would have to locate the trapped soldiers using visual reconnaissance and whatever radio fragments managed to break through the interference. The Khyner province spread below her like a three-dimensional puzzle of ridges, valleys, and peaks that could hide entire armies. Insurgents had used this terrain for decades, learning every cave, every trail, every position that offered tactical advantage. Finding 12 Americans in this landscape would be like locating a specific grain of sand on an endless beach. Mitchell began her search pattern at 15,000 feet, high enough to avoid small arms fire, but low enough to spot signs of combat on the ground. The A-10's optic systems could detect heat signatures, vehicle movement, and muzzle flashes, but the mountain terrain created shadows and dead zones that could conceal significant activity. On her third pass over the suspected area, she spotted something that made her blood run cold. Smoke was rising from a valley that should have been empty according to intelligence reports. More telling were the muzzle flashes that sparkled among the rocks like deadly stars. A firefight was definitely in progress below. She tried raising Slate 12 on every frequency, broadcasting on guard channels and emergency bands. For several minutes, only static answered her calls. Then, faintly, she heard a voice that would haunt her dreams for years to come. Any station, this is Slate 12. We are surrounded and taking heavy casualties. Can anyone hear us? Did you forget me? The transmission cut off abruptly, lost again in the jamming that blanketed the area. But Mitchell had heard enough to confirm location and understand the desperate situation below. 12 American soldiers were trapped in a valley, surrounded by enemy forces, with no apparent means of escape. She immediately contacted her base, requesting permission to engage and additional support aircraft. The response was frustratingly bureaucratic. She needed confirmation of friendly positions, positive identification of enemy forces, and approval from higher command authorities before employing weapons. Meanwhile, the situation on the ground continued to deteriorate. Through her aircraft sensors, Mitchell could see heat signatures moving among the rocks, converging on what appeared to be a small group of defenders. Time was running out for whoever was trapped below. Rodriguez had managed to get her radio working intermittently, broadcasting distress calls whenever the jamming lifted momentarily. She had no idea if anyone was receiving her transmissions, but protocol demanded she keep trying. Each call began with their unit designation and ended with the question that expressed their deepest fear. "Did you forget me?" The phrase came from their unit's unofficial motto, a reminder that no American soldier would ever be abandoned by their brothers and sisters in arms. It was both a plea for help and a challenge to anyone listening. Prove that the warrior's creed still meant something in a world where political considerations often overruled military necessity. Harrison had distributed his remaining ammunition among the team, knowing that their situation was becoming untenable. They had perhaps 2 hours of daylight left, and nightfall would bring new dangers. Insurgent forces were notorious for their night fighting capabilities, and thermal imaging devices could only provide limited advantage in close-quarter combat. Chen had identified at least 30 enemy positions surrounding their location, with more fighters arriving hourly. The insurgents were clearly preparing for a final assault, waiting for optimal conditions to overwhelm the trapped Americans. Without immediate support, Slate 12 would not survive another sunset. Dr. Kim moved between wounded team members, managing pain medications that were running dangerously low. Morrison's leg wound had worsened during movement, and specialist Rebecca Torres had taken shrapnel in her shoulder from a near-miss grenade. Both needed evacuation to proper medical facilities, but evacuation required rescue first. High above, Mitchell continued her reconnaissance, building a detailed picture of the tactical situation. She could see the insurgent positions, their fields of fire, their likely assault routes. More importantly, she could see how the terrain features could be used to break the enemy's advantage. Her weapon systems included a 30mm GU-8 cannon designed specifically for close air support, capable of delivering devastating firepower with surgical precision. She also carried rockets and bombs that could neutralize hardened positions. The problem was employing these weapons without endangering the soldiers she was trying to save. The A-10's design philosophy centered on survivability and firepower. Built to absorb battle damage and continue fighting, the aircraft could operate from improvised airstrips and maintain station over target areas for extended periods. Today, these capabilities would be tested against an enemy that had learned to respect American air power. Mitchell finally received permission to engage, but with strict limitations on weapons employment. She could use her cannon against confirmed enemy positions, but only when friendly forces were at least 300 meters away. Rockets and bombs were prohibited due to proximity concerns and potential civilian casualties. She began her first attack run with the characteristic roar of the GU-8 cannon that gave the A-10 its fearsome reputation. The sound was unmistakable on the ground, a deep, grinding noise that announced the arrival of close air support. For friendly forces, it was the most beautiful sound in the world. 20mm depleted uranium rounds tore through enemy positions with devastating effect. Fighters who had felt secure in their stone fortifications discovered that modern weapons could reach anywhere on the battlefield. The psychological impact was as important as the physical damage. Insurgents began abandoning positions rather than face the warthog's attention. Rodriguez heard the cannon fire and realized that help had finally arrived. She immediately began broadcasting targeting information, directing the aircraft toward the most dangerous enemy positions. The jamming continued, but the pilot seemed to understand their situation and was adapting tactics accordingly. Unknown aircraft, this is Slate 12, she transmitted during a brief break in the jamming. We are marking our position with infrared strobe. Danger close targets to our north and east. We have wounded who need immediate evacuation. Mitchell spotted the infrared marker and confirmed friendly positions. Now, she could begin systematically destroying the enemy positions that threatened the trapped soldiers. Each attack run brought new challenges as insurgents adapted their tactics, and attempted to engage her aircraft with everything from machine guns to shoulder-fired missiles. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since the ambush began, Slate 12 had hope. High above them, a guardian angel in the form of an A-10 Thunderbolt was writing their salvation in fire and steel across the Afghan sky. The battle reached a new intensity as Captain Mitchell continued her attack runs. Each pass over the valley brought her aircraft closer to the ground, increasing accuracy, but also exposing her to concentrated enemy fire. The A-10 was designed to absorb punishment, but even a mighty warthog had limits. On her fourth attack run, tracer rounds streaked past her cockpit like deadly fireworks. The insurgents had brought heavy machine guns into play, weapons capable of damaging even the heavily armored A-10. Mitchell felt the aircraft shudder as several rounds found their mark, but the redundant systems continued functioning normally. Below, Slate 12 was beginning to believe rescue might actually be possible. The accurate cannon fire had eliminated several enemy positions and forced others to relocate, breaking the stranglehold that had trapped them in a valley. But the insurgents were adapting, using the terrain to their advantage, and concentrating fire on the aircraft that threatened their victory. Chun coordinated movement with the airstrikes, using the confusion caused by each attack run to reposition his team members to better defensive positions. The leapfrog tactics that had saved them earlier now allowed them to take advantage of the supporting fires, moving closer to terrain that might allow extraction. Rodriguez had managed to establish intermittent communication with the aircraft, though jamming continued to disrupt most transmissions. Each contact lasted only seconds, but it was enough to pass critical targeting information and coordinate the next attack. The pilots seemed to understand their situation intuitively, often attacking positions before ground forces could identify them as threats. Dr. Kim used the covering fire to treat additional wounded team members. Specialist Davis had been hit by rock fragments during one of the enemy barges, and Sergeant Williams was showing signs of heat exhaustion combined with stress. The team's medical supplies were nearly exhausted, making evacuation increasingly critical. Mitchell's ammunition was also running low. The GEU-8 cannon was devastatingly effective, but it consumed ammunition at a prodigious rate. She had perhaps 3 more meaningful attack runs before being forced to leave the area to rearm and refuel. The thought of abandoning the trapped soldiers made her physically ill. During her next attack run, she spotted something that changed everything. Additional enemy forces were moving into the valley from the east, at least 24 fighters with heavy weapons and what appeared to be anti-aircraft systems. If those weapons reached effective positions, they could deny the airspace to rescue helicopters and make her own aircraft vulnerable to destruction. She immediately transmitted the intelligence to her base, requesting immediate additional support. The response was frustratingly slow. Other aircraft were already committed to operations across the theater, and extracting them would take time that Slate 12 didn't have. She would have to continue the fight alone for at least another hour. Harrison made the decision to attempt a breakout toward higher ground. The supporting fires had disrupted enemy positions enough to create a brief window of opportunity, but that window was closing rapidly as insurgents recovered from the initial shock of air attack. Slate 12 would have to move now or risk being trapped again. The movement began with covering fire from their remaining ammunition. Each team member carried wounded comrades who could not move independently, making their progress slower and more vulnerable to enemy observation. But the alternative was certain death in a position they could not defend indefinitely. Mitchell spotted the ground movement and immediately adjusted her attack pattern to provide covering fire for the retreating soldiers. She flew lower than recommended, using terrain features to mask her approach until the last possible moment. The technique was dangerous, but necessary. Surprise was their only advantage against overwhelming numbers. Her cannon fire walked across the hillside ahead of the moving soldiers, destroying enemy positions that threatened their route. Return fire intensified as insurgents realized their quarry was attempting to escape. Machine gun tracers and rocket-propelled grenades filled the air around the advancing Americans. Valdez was hit during the movement, a bullet shattering his collarbone and spinning him to the ground. Morrison, despite his own wound, immediately turned back to help his teammate. The action exposed both men to concentrated fire from positions Mitchell couldn't see from her angle of attack. Rodriguez coordinated the evacuation while simultaneously calling for medical support. Her radio transmissions were fragmentary, but urgent. "We have multiple wounded. Need immediate dust-off, continuing movement to higher ground." The static that answered her calls seemed to mock their desperate situation. Chun reached the ridgeline first, immediately establishing overwatch positions to cover the remaining team members. From the higher elevation, he could see the full scope of the enemy forces arrayed against them. The intelligence estimates had been completely wrong. There were at least 100 insurgents in the valley, not the 20 or 30 originally reported. Dr. Kim worked frantically on Valdez's wound, while return fire forced them to remain in whatever cover they could find. The collarbone fracture was severe, and internal bleeding was a real possibility. He needed surgery within hours or risk permanent disability. The medication that might save his life was back at the base they might never see again. Mitchell had been airborne for over 7 hours, approaching the limits of her aircraft's endurance. Fuel gauges showed critical levels, and several warning lights indicated battle damage that would require immediate attention upon landing. She faced a choice that no pilot wanted to make: continue fighting until her aircraft was no longer airworthy, or abandon the ground forces to seek fuel and repairs. The decision was made for her when tracer rounds found her left engine. Warning alarms filled the cockpit as the engine began losing power, forcing her to adjust flight parameters to maintain airspeed. The A-10 could fly on one engine, but performance was significantly degraded, especially at high altitude. She transmitted her status to base command, knowing that leaving the area would probably doom Slate 12. But crashing her aircraft would help no one, and other lives depended on her survival. Military leadership often required impossible choices, and today was testing every principle she held sacred. As she began climbing toward safer altitude, her radio crackled with a transmission that stopped her cold. Through the static and jamming, she heard a voice she recognized from earlier calls. "Angel in the sky, this is Slate 12. We know you have to go. Thank you for not forgetting us. We'll hold here as long as we can." The transmission ended with the hiss of static, but the words echoed in Mitchell's mind as she struggled with her decision. Below her, 12 American soldiers prepared to make their final stand against overwhelming odds. Above her, the sky offered safety and the chance to fight another day. She looked at her fuel gauges one more time, calculating range and endurance with the precision that had kept her alive through dozens of combat missions. The numbers told her to leave, but her heart demanded she stay. Sometimes, the difference between victory and defeat came down to decisions that couldn't be measured in fuel flow rates or ammunition counts. Banking her damaged aircraft back toward the valley, Mitchell made her choice. She would stay with Slate 12 until the end, whatever that end might be. In the fading afternoon light, the battle for survival was about to reach its climax, and one pilot's decision would determine whether 12 warriors came home or joined the long list of heroes who died far from home in service to their country. Captain Mitchell's damaged A-10 limped back toward the valley as the sun began its final descent behind the western peaks. Her fuel was critically low, one engine was failing, and hydraulic pressure was dropping steadily. By every rational calculation, she should have been heading for the nearest safe landing strip. Instead, she was flying toward certain destruction to buy a few more minutes for 12 soldiers who had become more than a mission. The radio crackled as she approached the valley, and through the static she heard Rodriguez's voice, strained but determined. "Angel aircraft, you came back. We thought." The transmission cut off as enemy jamming resumed, but Mitchell had heard enough to know that Slate 12 was still fighting. From her position on the ridgeline, Rodriguez watched the familiar silhouette of the A-10 reappear against the darkening sky. Around her, the remaining members of Slate 12 prepared for what might be their final battle. Ammunition was nearly exhausted, medical supplies were gone, and 3 team members were wounded too severely to continue fighting effectively. Chen had counted muzzle flashes from at least 80 different positions surrounding their location. The insurgents had used the break and air strikes to reinforce their numbers and improve their positions. More concerning were the heavy weapons that had been moved into the valley, weapons capable of shooting down rescue helicopters and finishing the trapped Americans. Harrison made his final preparations, distributing the last of their ammunition and ensuring that sensitive equipment would be destroyed rather than captured. His thoughts turned to the families who would receive news of this mission, the wives and children who had learned that their loved ones had died in a valley whose name they couldn't pronounce, fighting an enemy they barely understood. Dr. Kim sat beside Valdez, whose condition had worsened significantly. The internal bleeding she had feared was now obvious, and without immediate surgery, he would not survive another hour. She had done everything possible with field medicine, but some wounds required miracles rather than medical training. Morrison, despite his own leg wound, had taken position with the team's remaining heavy weapon. His hands were steady as he sighted through the scope, searching for targets that might threaten his teammates. The pain in his leg had become a distant ache compared to the fire burning in his chest, the absolute refusal to let his brothers and sisters down. Mitchell began her final attack runs with systematic precision, targeting the heavy weapons that posed the greatest threat to potential rescue aircraft. Her damaged aircraft responded sluggishly to control inputs, and the failing engine made each maneuver a calculated risk. But accuracy remained perfect as she delivered devastating fire against enemy positions. The Gu-8 cannon roared its defiance across the valley, sending streams of depleted uranium rounds into insurgent strongholds. Each burst was carefully aimed to avoid the American position while maximizing damage to enemy capabilities. She was writing her legacy in fire, knowing that this mission would likely be her last. Rodriguez managed to establish contact with an approaching rescue force, though communication remained fragmentary. 2 Black Hawks were en route, escorted by attack helicopters and another A-10. But they were still 20 minutes away, and Slate 12's position was deteriorating by the minute. The insurgents launched their final assault as darkness began to settle over the valley. Dozens of fighters emerged from concealed positions, advancing on the American position from multiple directions. Their objective was clear: overrun the defenders before help could arrive, capturing or killing every member of Slate 12. Chin's rifle spoke with methodical precision as targets presented themselves in the failing light. Each shot was aimed with the knowledge that ammunition could not be wasted, that every round had a count in the mathematics of survival. Around him, his teammates maintained disciplined fire despite impossible odds. Mitchell saw the ground assault beginning and knew her aircraft could make the difference between victory and massacre. She dove toward the valley floor, flying lower than any sane pilot would attempt in damaged aircraft. At 200 feet above the ground, she could see individual fighters and place cannon rounds with surgical precision. Her first pass broke the assault before it could develop momentum, sending insurgents scrambling for cover as 30mm rounds tore through their ranks. But the effort cost her dearly. Small arms fire peppered her aircraft, and several critical systems failed simultaneously. Warning lights filled her cockpit like Christmas decorations. The second pass was even lower, even more dangerous. She could see muzzle flashes from positions that threatened her aircraft, but also spot insurgents advancing on Slate 12's position. Her cannon fire walked through enemy formations with devastating effect, stopping the assault cold and giving the ground team precious additional minutes. Rodriguez heard the distinctive sound of approaching helicopters, faint but growing stronger. The rescue force was finally arriving, but they would need a clear landing zone to extract the wounded. That meant eliminating the remaining enemy positions that could engage helicopters during their most vulnerable moments. Mitchell's fuel gauge showed empty, but the engines continued running on fumes and determination. She had perhaps one more attack run before being forced to attempt an emergency landing in hostile territory. The irony was not lost on her. In trying to save 12 soldiers, she might become the 13th American trapped in this godforsaken valley. Harrison coordinated the final defense as insurgents regrouped for another assault. His team was down to their last magazines, and 3 wounded members could no longer contribute to the fight. But they had reached the extraction point, and helicopters were finally approaching through the mountain passes. The rescue Black Hawks appeared like salvation itself, escorted by Apache attack helicopters that immediately engaged remaining enemy positions. Their 30mm chain guns and Hellfire missiles turned the tide of battle decisively, silencing the heavy weapons that had threatened the extraction. Mitchell used her final ammunition to clear the landing zone, her cannon fire precise despite her aircraft's degraded condition. As the last rounds left her gun, she felt the unique satisfaction of a mission completed against impossible odds. Slate 12 would go home, and that made everything worthwhile. The extraction happened with practiced efficiency despite enemy fire. Wounded team members were loaded first, followed by the rest of the team as covering fire suppressed insurgent positions. Within 3 minutes, both helicopters were climbing towards safety with their precious cargo. Rodriguez was the last aboard, turning back toward the valley where an unknown pilot had risked everything to save them. She keyed her radio one final time. "Angel Aircraft, this is Slate 12. We're going home because of you. Thank you for not forgetting us." Mitchell heard the transmission as she struggled to keep her dying aircraft airborne long enough to reach friendly territory. Both engines were failing now, and hydraulic fluid painted her cockpit windows red. But Slate 12 was safe, and that knowledge sustained her through the emergency procedures that might keep her alive. She managed to nurse the A-10 to a forward operating base, landing with no fuel, no hydraulics, and battle damage that would keep the aircraft grounded for months. As she climbed from the cockpit, ground crew members stared in amazement at an aircraft that should have been destroyed hours earlier. Later investigation would reveal the scope of the ambush that trapped Slate 12. Over 150 insurgent fighters had participated in an operation plan for weeks specifically to target American reconnaissance teams. The intelligence they sought to protect was later used to disrupt supply networks that saved countless coalition lives. Harrison would receive the Silver Star for his leadership under fire. Chun, Rodriguez, and others would earn Bronze Stars with valor devices. Dr. Kim will be credited with saving 3 lives under impossible conditions. But they all knew who the real hero was, a pilot who risked everything because she understood that no one gets left behind. Mitchell would eventually learn that her actions that day had prevented what could have been the largest single loss of American Special Operations personnel in the Afghan theater. She never saw herself as heroic, just as someone who did her job when people needed help. That humility made her heroism all the more genuine. The question, "Did you forget me?" would become something of a legend in military circles, representing the unbreakable bond between warriors who serve together. It reminded everyone who heard it that courage is not the absence of fear, but acting despite fear when others depend on your strength. Years later, when Slate 12 members gathered for reunions, they would always observe a moment of silence for their guardian angel. Captain Sarah Mitchell had given them the greatest gift possible, the chance to go home to their families and continue serving their country. In the brotherhood of combat, there is no higher honor than saving your fellow warriors when they need you most. The mountains of Afghanistan would witness many more battles, claim many more lives, and test the resolve of countless warriors. But in one valley, on one desperate afternoon, 12 American soldiers learned that they would never be forgotten, never be abandoned, and never fight alone. That knowledge, more than any weapon or technology, made them unconquerable.